When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had finally found peace, the kind of quiet suburban life people dream about after years of working in the chaos of the city, and for a while it felt perfect. The house was spacious, the lawn was lush and green after weeks of careful tending, and the neighbors seemed friendly enough, at least on the surface. But as I would come to learn, one neighbor in particular was not just unfriendly, but downright antagonistic, a woman everyone whispered about, but no one dared confront directly the self-proclaimed enforcer of the Homeowners Association, better known in hushed tones as Karen. From the very beginning, she rubbed me the wrong way, with her condescending tone, endless complaints, and obsessive monitoring of every inch of the neighborhood. But the real problem began when she decided that my lawn was a shortcut for her daily commute, and instead of using the street like a normal person, she drove her oversized SUV directly across my grass, tearing up the soil and leaving deep tracks as if it were her personal driveway. And no matter how many times I confronted her politely, asking her to stop, she smirked, tossed her blonde bob arrogantly, and said things like, "The HOA has jurisdiction here, and you're lucky we let you keep this lawn at all," which made my blood boil because I had bought this land outright and knew for a fact that she had no authority over it. At first, I tried the reasonable approaches, placing decorative stones, installing small solar lights along the edge of the property, even putting up a polite wooden sign that said, "Please keep off the grass," but none of it deterred her. In fact, she seemed to relish the defiance, deliberately accelerating when crossing my yard so that mud sprayed up against my porch, and when I caught her laughing about it with her friends at a neighborhood barbecue, I realized she wasn't just careless, she was malicious. The final straw came one morning when I went outside to find a huge rut carved straight through the center of my lawn, ruining weeks of reseeding and watering, and there she was, parked in front of her house, sipping coffee with the smug satisfaction of someone who thought she was untouchable. And that was the moment something inside me shifted, a cold determination replacing my frustration. Because if she wanted to treat my property like a battlefield, then I would respond in kind, only smarter, quieter, and with the kind of patience that people like her could never imagine. So I started planning, not with anger, but with calculation, remembering my years in the military and the kind of training most people would never suspect a suburban homeowner to have, the kind of training that taught me about traps, deterrence, and psychological warfare. And though I had no intention of truly harming anyone, I did have the means to create something convincing enough to scare the arrogance right out of her. I spent weeks in my garage tinkering, building mock mines using pressure plates, soil-colored casings, and harmless but dramatic effects like bursts of chalk powder, small air canisters, and even paint cartridges that would explode upward if weight was applied, all designed to look and feel like the real deal while being completely non-lethal. And as I buried them carefully under the most frequently abused stretch of lawn, covering the soil meticulously so that no one could tell the difference, I felt a strange satisfaction brewing inside me, not the reckless joy of revenge, but the disciplined confidence of someone taking back control of his territory. And when I stood there one evening, watching the sun dip behind the houses while the mines rested just beneath the earth, I almost pitied her for what was about to happen. But then I remembered every time she laughed in my face, every patch of grass she had destroyed, and I decided pity was a luxury she hadn't earned. The trap was set, and all that was left to do was wait, but waiting has a way of sharpening anticipation, of making every sound of her SUV engine in the distance feel like the beat of a war drum. And though my hands were steady, my heart pounded with the thrill of what was to come, because sometimes in a world where people like Karen believe rules don't apply to them, the only way to restore balance is to give them a taste of consequences they can't laugh their way out of. The next morning I woke with a plan so precise it felt clinical, as if I were a stage manager plotting the cues for the biggest scene of my life. I moved through the house with a calm that surprised even me, checking the disguise triggers one more time, ensuring they would only produce startling but harmless effects. A loud bang of compressed air, a burst of biodegradable chalk, and a cascade of harmless glitter confetti I'd scavenged from a craft store, nothing that could cause injury or permanent damage. Because despite how furious Karen had made me, I'm not a monster and I wasn't interested in physical harm. I wanted humiliation, a loss of the smug posture she wore like armor, and the idea was simple: create an unmistakable spectacle that would be impossible for her to ignore, something that would make her reconsider the ease with which she treated other people's property as an extension of her ego. And so I camouflaged the last of the devices beneath the sod, tamped the earth to match the surrounding lawn, and then sat on my porch with a cup of coffee that tasted like a dare, watching the street as if I were a hawk scanning for prey. For while the neighborhood behaved like an obedient stage, mail trucks trundled by, kids rode bikes doing their best to ignore the showdown about to unfold, and Karen's house remained a quiet, contemptuous silhouette. But of course, she would not let the day pass without making her presence known at precisely 9:30. When the sunlight had warmed the asphalt just enough to make the air shimmer, the rumble of her SUV announced her arrival, and I felt an odd, almost ceremonial pulse in my chest as she swung the vehicle into my yard as if it belonged to her family line, tires crunching the carefully tended grass. And then the world transformed into that sharp, hyperreal moment when everything is both absurd and inevitable. The pressure plate depressed, the first canister hissed, and a gout of white powder shot into the air, exploding around the hood of her SUV like a snowstorm in July. She slammed on the brakes, eyes wide, her face a palette of outrage and confusion, and for a beat, she simply sat there, frozen, while the chalk dust settled on her windshield and the outline of her license plate glowed like a badge of shame. Then, as she fumbled for the door, the second device triggered and produced a thunderous pop that reverberated through the yards, a sound so theatrical it belonged in a movie, followed by a plume of glitter that arced beautifully and landed on her hair, her shoulders, and the driver's seat in a constellation of sparkles that caught the sun and refused to be ignored. And when she finally stepped out, pearls of glitter clung to her skin like evidence, and the look on her face was a study in disbelief turning quickly to fury. The kind of fury that usually requires an audience. She screamed loud, high, and unrefined, and pointed at me across the lawn as if accusing me of some grave crime. And that's when I realized I hadn't considered the performance's secondary effects. Neighbors would come out, cameras would emerge, and gossip would migrate faster than any official notice. Within seconds, Mr. Alvarez from 2 houses down was on his porch with his phone raised, and the elderly woman who fed the neighborhood cats shuffled into the street, flapping her cardigan like a banner. Karen's voice cut the morning, sharp, demanding dripping entitlement. What is wrong with you? Do you realize what you did? I'm calling the HOA. I'm calling the police, which drew a sympathetic murmur from a few onlookers who'd seen the glitter and assumed the worst. But then something human and unexpected happened. A little girl from across the street, about 7, trotted over with a look of unfiltered delight and a hand full of chalk drawings in her pocket, and she squealed with laughter at the glitter on Karen's shoulder, as if Karen had become a walking art project rather than a sworn enemy, and the sound fractured the tension for a moment, making even me grin despite the knot of nerves in my stomach. Karen, however, was unamused and immediately began crying wolf, her voice gone shrill with indignation, demanding compensation, demanding apologies, demanding that I explain why I would sabotage her car and humiliate her. And the neighbors started to take sides, some shaking their heads at what looked like petty neighborhood warfare, others curious, waiting for the next act. I walked toward her slowly, palms open to show I, carried nothing but intention, and when I crossed into the area she'd trampled so often, she flinched as if I'd pattered the field with snakes, eyes narrowing into slits of accusation. But I kept my voice low and level, the calm in my tone more disarming than any argument I could have hurled, and I told her plainly that the devices were a warning, a theatrical intervention designed to stop her from treating my land like an extension of her commute, and I explained, without going into technical detail, that nothing was dangerous and that the effects were temporary and non-toxic. The response I expected was outrage, maybe legal threats, but instead I saw something else unfold, a crack in her performance of infallibility, a slip of shame that came when the reality of being made a spectacle pierced her armor, and for a second she looked smaller, like the caricature everyone had whispered about but rarely confronted. Then, like a switch, Karen moved into damage control mode, smoothing her expression into practiced indignation and calling for the HOA board as if her connections could rewrite the morning. But the board members who arrived, 2 of them hobbling down the street in sensible shoes, looked at the glitter and the chalk, and then at the rut in the lawn, and their faces said what their voices held back. They had no interest in siding with a bully if the evidence of her trespass was this public and undeniable. And as they debated whether to fine her or fine me, the scene took on a surreal quality, like a small town play where the script had been shredded and improvisation was the only currency left. And while the adults argued about liability and decorum, the children moved between them like a chorus, picking up stray bits of glitter and laughing, treating the aftermath like a festival rather than a feud. As the debate spiraled on the curb, I stood there silently letting Karen spin her web of accusations and half-truths, her voice cracking with the desperation of someone who felt her power slipping away. But what she didn't realize was that silence, used correctly, is sharper than any weapon, because every word she hurled at me, every accusation of sabotage, every demand for punishment, was being weighed against the undeniable evidence of her own SUV tracks gouged across my lawn, her glitter, coated hair sparkling under the sun like the crown of her arrogance, and the fact that half the neighborhood had witnessed her repeated trespassing long before today. The HOA board members shifted uneasily as she ranted, because while they had tolerated her antics in the past, even leaned on her ferocity to intimidate homeowners into compliance, it was clear now that she was more liability than leader, and when Mr. Alvarez, never one to mince words, finally spoke up from his porch, his voice carried the weight of collective exhaustion. Karen, we've all seen you do this. Over and over again, this man asked you to stop and you laughed at him. Now you're reaping what you sowed, so don't act surprised. The silence that followed was damning, broken only by the faint rattle of glitter settling on Karen's windshield, and though she tried to laugh it off, claiming Alvarez was just jealous of her position, the board members' crossed arms and narrowed eyes told me her excuses were unraveling. I could see the storm brewing behind her fake smile, the twitch at the corner of her mouth that betrayed how close she was to breaking, and sure enough, she snapped. Not with words at first, but with action, storming back into her SUV, slamming the door with a violence that echoed down the street, revving the engine as if she could erase the humiliation by drowning it in horsepower, and before anyone could stop her, she gunned it forward again, this time deliberately aiming straight across my yard with a defiant sneer plastered on her face as though to say, "Your tricks won't stop me." But what she hadn't realized was that my preparations weren't limited to the first line of mock mines. I had installed a secondary set, deeper into the grass, rigged with even more dramatic effects, and when her tires rolled over the hidden plates, a synchronized series of pops and bangs went off in perfect sequence, releasing a combination of red chalk powder compressed air blasts, and a final payload of neon orange paint that sprayed directly upward, coating the underside of her SUV, and splattering across the hood like the flames of some cartoonish explosion. The crowd gasped, kids shrieked with delight, and Karen's mouth dropped open in sheer disbelief as her shiny vehicle, once her prized weapon of intimidation, was transformed into a rolling circus attraction, dripping orange paint onto the ground with each turn of the wheels. She screeched to a halt, leapt out of the driver's seat, and spun around in hysterics, pointing at me and screaming about lawsuits, police, terrorism, and every other exaggerated accusation she could conjure. But this time the crowd wasn't murmuring with uncertainty, they were laughing not cruelly, but with the cathartic release of years of frustration finally boiling over into absurdity, and in that laughter Karen's authority crumbled like a sandcastle meeting the tide, because there is nothing more devastating to a tyrant than being made ridiculous in front of her subjects. She tried to bark back control, shouting at the HOA board to fine me into oblivion, but one of the board members, an older man named Leonard who had clearly lost patience with her theatrics, raised his hand and said, "Enough, Karen. We've warned you about harassing neighbors. You brought this on yourself." Her face twisted at that, a mixture of betrayal and disbelief, because for the first time the board wasn't shielding her but exposing her, and when Leonard turned to me and added, "We'll need to discuss how you went about this, but your point has been made," it was clear the tide had turned completely. Karen stood trembling, fists clenched at her sides, her once manicured image ruined by powder, glitter, and streaks of neon paint that made her look like the failed star of a slapstick comedy show, and though she tried one last desperate gambit, threatening to call the police, her credibility was already shattered because multiple neighbors stepped forward to give witness accounts of her trespassing, offering testimonies that they'd been too afraid to share before today. The weight of collective truth pressed down on her, leaving her shrill threats sounding more pathetic than powerful, and as she stomped back to her SUV, now painted like a neon disaster on wheels, I caught her. I just long enough to let her see that I wasn't gloating, wasn't laughing. I was simply resolved the way a soldier stands after defending ground he refused to surrender, and in that brief exchange I saw something flicker in her expression, not fear exactly, but the dawning realization that her reign over the neighborhood was not eternal, and that her arrogance had finally met an equal who wouldn't bend. She peeled away down the street, tires squealing, leaving behind a trail of orange. Droplets that glittered under the sun like breadcrumbs marking her retreat, and as the neighbors gathered closer, buzzing with the kind of gossip that would spread faster than any HOA memo, I sat back down on my porch, exhaling slowly, knowing that this battle was far from over, because Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly, and the war for my lawn had only just entered its most dangerous phase. The neighborhood felt different in the days after Karen's dramatic retreat, as though the air itself had been scrubbed clean of her oppressive dominance, and for the first time in months, I noticed neighbors waving to me without hesitation, some even walking over to quietly thank me for standing up to her, confessing that they had endured their own smaller battles with her pettiness but had never dared to push back for fear of being targeted. Yet, while their gratitude was comforting, I wasn't naive enough to believe the conflict was resolved, because people like Karen don't retreat forever. They plot, they brood, and they wait for opportunities to strike back harder than before. And sure enough, the first signs of her counteroffensive arrived, not even 3 days later when I found a neatly folded letter shoved into my mailbox, not mailed, but hand-delivered in the kind of crisp, officious stationery that screamed self-importance. Inside was a typed notice from the HOA board citing me for unauthorized construction on community property and threatening fines for hazardous modifications, language that had Karen's fingerprints all over it, because she had clearly tried to spin the mock mines into a violation of HOA bylaws, though she underestimated two key facts. One, the lawn was indisputably mine, purchased outright, and two, the devices weren't dangerous in the least, meaning she would have to stretch credibility to prove her case, and stretching credibility was something she had already exhausted after the neon paint fiasco. Still, the notice was irritating, and I knew that ignoring it would only embolden her, so I marched straight to the next board meeting with a folder of evidence, photographs of the tire ruts, timestamps of her repeated trespassing, video footage from neighbors who had recorded the glitter explosion, and even a notarized statement from Mr. Alvarez affirming that Karen had been warned repeatedly before I resorted to my theatrical deterrence. And when the board convened in the cramped clubhouse, I laid everything out with the calm precision of a prosecutor dismantling a flimsy case, while Karen, sitting across the table in a stiff blazer that still bore faint sparkles of glitter she hadn't managed to scrub out, fumed and interrupted, her words tripping over each other as she tried to frame herself as the victim of domestic terrorism, a phrase so overblown that it actually drew laughter from one of the younger board members. I didn't laugh, though. I just waited, hands folded, letting her dig her own hole deeper until Leonard, the older board member who had already lost patience with her, banged his gavel on the table and said firmly enough, Karen, we are here to evaluate facts, not hysterics. The weight of the room shifted then, tilting in my favor, because facts were the one thing Karen couldn't bend to her will, and after an hour of deliberation, the board not only dismissed her citation against me, but also issued her a formal warning for repeated harassment of a fellow homeowner, effectively stripping her of the informal authority she'd wielded like a weapon for years. The look on her face when the gavel came down was one I'll never forget, an expression that mixed rage, humiliation, and something close to panic, because Karen thrived on fear, and when the board itself stopped feeding that fear, she was left exposed, vulnerable, and desperate. But desperate people are dangerous, and as I walked back home with my folder under my arm and the board's ruling in my favor, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done, that she was already scheming her next move, something outside the bounds of official channels, something vindictive and personal, and I was, right, because that night, just past midnight, I heard the distinct crunch of tires on gravel where no tires should be, followed by the faint beam of headlights sweeping across my backyard like searchlights. And when I peered through the blinds, my gut tightened as I saw Karen's SUV idling just beyond the fence, her silhouette hunched forward in the driver's seat like a predator waiting for the right moment to pounce. She wasn't on my lawn this time, not yet, but the intent in her stillness was unmistakable, and though part of me wanted to storm outside and confront her, I forced myself to stay calm, to think strategically rather than emotionally, because confrontation on her terms would only play into her narrative. Instead, I quietly retrieved my phone, recorded the scene, and texted the footage to a trusted neighbor with the message: "If anything happens, you know who to point to." With that insurance secured, I switched on the floodlights, bathing the lawn in harsh white brilliance that left Karen exposed like a thief caught in the act, and sure enough, she gunned her engine and sped away into the night, her tail lights disappearing down the street. But the encounter left me restless, prowling the house like a sentry until dawn because it confirmed what I already knew. Karen wasn't defeated, she was cornered, and a cornered animal lashes out. Over the next week, petty retaliations followed like clockwork. Anonymous complaints to the county about illegal structures on my property that inspectors dismissed with bemusement, dead patches of lawn where someone had clearly poured salt under cover of darkness, and even a broken mailbox that I strongly suspected was no accident. And while each act was small on its own, the cumulative effect was an attempt to wear me down, to sap my patience until I either cracked or surrendered. But what Karen failed to understand was that endurance had been drilled into me long ago, in places far harsher than a suburban street, and rather than wearing me down, her petty war only strengthened my resolve. So I began planning again, not another glitter explosion or paint trap, but something quieter, something psychological, a way to show her that every move she made would only tighten the noose around her own reputation until even the allies she thought she had left would abandon her. And as I sat on my porch, one evening, sipping coffee with deliberate calm while she stood in her driveway, glaring daggers at me, I realized that the true battle wasn't for my lawn anymore, it was for control of the entire neighborhood. And this time, the battlefield wasn't soil or grass, but perception, trust, and the narrative that people chose to believe. By the time the final confrontation arrived, the neighborhood had become a stage upon which every move between Karen and me was scrutinized, whispered about, and debated like some suburban soap opera, and while she had escalated with petty vandalism, late-night intimidation, and endless HOA complaints, I had quietly countered by documenting everything, building an airtight case that would one day bury her attempts at control under a mountain of undeniable evidence. But still I knew evidence alone wouldn't break someone like Karen, because her strength had never been in truth but in perception, in the fear she inspired, in the way she manipulated people into believing resistance was futile. And so I devised a plan that would dismantle her not just legally but socially, stripping away the illusion of power until even her most loyal enablers saw her for what she truly was: a bully standing on crumbling ground. The opportunity came during the neighborhood's annual community day, a cheerful gathering with food stalls, games, and live music that Karen usually dominated by strutting around in her self-proclaimed role as queen of the HOA, barking orders and pretending the entire event existed because of her leadership. But this year I came prepared, and with the help of several neighbors who had grown tired of her tyranny, we set the trap, not one of fake mines or paint blasts, but of exposure, carefully timed and utterly devastating. While the families gathered on the green, I set up a projector under the guise of offering a slideshow of community photos, something wholesome and nostalgic, and Karen, predictably, took the bait, arriving in an ostentatious floral dress, dripping jewelry, and carrying a clipboard she waved around like a scepter, loudly declaring how wonderful it was that she had organized everything, despite the fact that nearly all the work had been done by volunteers who now smirked behind her back. When it came time for the slideshow, I stepped onto the makeshift stage and announced I wanted to share something with the neighborhood, something that showed both the challenges we faced and the resilience we had as a community. And as the first images appeared on the screen, photos of happy barbecues, block parties, and children's chalk drawings, Karen smiled smugly, assuming she would feature prominently as the star of it all. But then the tone shifted. The photos cut to images of my lawn torn up by tire tracks, the time stamped, videos of her SUV barreling across it, the glitter explosion, the orange paint disaster, even the footage of her lurking outside my fence at night. And as each image appeared, gasps rippled through the crowd, murmurs swelled into open outrage, and the laughter that followed at her ridiculous humiliation was the final nail in the coffin of her credibility. She shrieked from the crowd, demanding I turn it off, threatening legal action, screaming that I was lying and manipulating, but the evidence was too clear, too damning, and the neighbors who once cowered now laughed, clapped, and even booed her when she tried to seize the microphone, forcing her into a spotlight she could no longer control. Her face reddened, her voice cracked, and the glitter that still clung stubbornly to her hair caught the stage lights like a mocking halo as she realized, perhaps for the first time in years, that no one was buying her act anymore. In that moment, she was exposed, not as the fierce enforcer of neighborhood, order she believed herself to be, but as a desperate, flailing caricature of authority whose reign had ended not with dignity, but with farce. And when she finally stormed off, shoving past families who no longer parted for her, the applause that followed wasn't for me. It was for the freedom the neighborhood felt as her shadow receded. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board quietly voted to remove her from any official capacity, citing harassment, misconduct, and behavior unbecoming of a community representative, and while she still lived on the street, she did so as a pariah, neighbors turning away when she tried to approach, children whispering jokes about the Glitter Queen, and even her once pristine SUV still bore faint streaks of orange paint she hadn't fully managed to erase like scars of her downfall. My lawn, once the battlefield of our feud, grew back lush and unscarred, each blade of grass a quiet testament to patience and perseverance, and though I kept my mock mines stored away in the garage, just in case, I never had to use them again because the message had been delivered loud and clear. Trespassers, bullies, and tyrants could not thrive where truth and resilience stood firm. Sometimes when I sit on the porch now, sipping coffee in the early morning while the sun climbs over the rooftops, I reflect on how absurd yet inevitable the whole saga had been, how a simple refusal to be trampled, literally and figuratively, had sparked a chain of events that freed an entire community from a woman who mistook fear for respect. And though Karen may still glare at me from her driveway, clutching her clipboard like a relic of lost power, I no longer feel anger toward her, only a quiet satisfaction. Because in the end, the mines I planted were never meant to destroy her, but to reveal her. And once revealed, she destroyed herself. The battlefield is quiet now, the war for my lawn long over, and in its place there is peace hard earned, and glitter dusted, but peace nonetheless.